not hear me, just drop a message in the chat. But I'm assuming I see no messages as of now, so I'm allowing myself to continue. My name is Stephan Joppich, and I've written about loneliness for 1.5 years now. I've researched it for 2 years, and well, yeah, I've been dipping in and out of loneliness for pretty much my entire life, as I'm sure many of you can relate. So before we dive in, I just wanted to share 3 short disclaimers. The first one being, this is a talk about loneliness, and I'm not a mental health professional. I'm also not a neuroscientist or a psychologist. So if you do seriously struggle with loneliness, I recommend seeking out a mental health professional. I'm just a normal guy who wanted to explore this feeling and wanted to feel less lonely. So the second disclaimer is that I'm normally a writer, and I typically have all this time to think about sentences and edit them and delete them. And today I don't, so this is very much going to be new for me and a bit freestyle. But yeah, we're going to make the most of it. And the third disclaimer is, if you have any questions or if you hear anything that piques your interest, you have the option to ask a question. I think it's the blue button on the bottom right, and then I should be able to see it, hopefully. So yeah, I don't want this to be just something where I vomit words in your face and yeah, just be like a throwback to the COVID Zoom meetings. But yeah, I want to make this more like a discussion. So I'll talk for 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, and then there will be time to ask questions and have a conversation. So this talk is called What Nobody Taught You About Loneliness, because I always had the feeling that I was never taught about loneliness. Like, we learn about all these subjects in school, math, economics, you name it, but loneliness is such a common and distressing feeling, and yet nobody ever teaches us what it actually is, how we should talk about it, and how we can cope with it. So today, my goal is to change that. And even if you just like take away one tiny thing about loneliness, then my goal will be achieved. So today I want to share 3 things in particular with you that during all my research on loneliness have erupted themselves as sort of some of the most useful lessons. And these are, number 1, the loneliness formula, which sort of explains why we feel lonely, what loneliness actually is, and how we can put it into words. The second one is the loneliness loop, which explains why we get stuck in social isolation and why it's so hard to break free, and also why loneliness sort of takes a toll on us. And the third thing is sort of how we can cope with loneliness. Like, since it's such a difficult feeling to deal with, what there is we can actually do. So before I dive into the 3 points, maybe some personal history. So in one of the loneliest times of my life, I was living in Portugal, and I'd moved there all by myself to sort of try what it's like to be a full-time writer. And it was strange because I was living in a house with 10 other people. I had this great co-working space I went to daily. And also I had some friends there and general connections. Like, I had a Portuguese class, and yet it didn't feel like I had all these people around me. Like, I've constantly felt lonely and so disconnected. And that's really where I started questioning and started thinking about, like, why why do I feel so lonely even though I have all these people around me? And that has sort of brought me to what I now call the loneliness formula. And the loneliness formula is based on some of the most acknowledged definitions of loneliness. And that's essentially that loneliness is a distressing feeling caused by the discrepancy between desired social connections and perceived social connections. So if we convert this into a formula, it would be loneliness equals desired connections minus perceived connections. And the result of this equation would be the amount of loneliness we feel. So the higher our desired connections and the lower our perceived connections, this gap in between is loneliness. So the higher our desired connections and the lower our perceived connections, the higher levels of loneliness we're going to feel. And this explains why I felt so lonely during that time in Portugal, because I had this extreme desire to get to know new people in Portugal, to learn the language, to build a community, to find new friends, maybe find a partner. And yet I felt none of that. Like, I just had too high expectations, but none of that really resonated with me. None of those connections felt deep enough. I remember I had this one roommate, and like one of my 10 roommates, and he would just always greet me with, hey bro, how's it going, bro? And then I was like, yeah, good, and you? And that was it. But that just felt me longing for more. So this explains why we can be very much alone but not feel lonely. Like when we're happily alone but don't feel lonely, we don't have a desire for connections, and we perceive enough connections from ourselves. And the English language has a wonderful word for this, which is solitude. And it also explains why we can be among other people and feel extremely lonely. In fact, I think that's where real loneliness strikes, because the connection is almost there in front of you, like it's right there, you can grasp it, but it doesn't really connect. And this frustration really turbocharges loneliness. So this brings us to point number 2, which is the loneliness formula. The loneliness loop is number 2. And the loneliness loop is essentially the self-fulfilling prophecy that perceived loneliness, like this feeling of loneliness, will actually lead to social isolation. And that's what makes it so tricky. So to understand this, some very brief evolutionary history of loneliness. Like, why do we feel loneliness? What's the purpose of loneliness? And originally, loneliness was nothing but an incentive, a motivator from our mind and body to signal us that we need social connections. So loneliness is on the same hierarchy as hunger, thirst, breathlessness, and physical pain. Loneliness is social pain, and this social pain, that we've all felt it after being rejected, or after someone said something to us that hurt us. We feel the social pain of loneliness, and this pain lights up in the same brain regions as these other fundamental survival mechanisms like hunger, pain, physical pain, thirst, etc. So it's really a fundamental mechanism for humans. But of course, loneliness isn't as easy to be solved as hunger. Like when we're hungry, we can just go to the fridge and grab something, but loneliness is much trickier to deal with. And so the question is, what happens when we can't soothe this social pain? Like what happens when like in my case, when I was in Portugal, I was unable to make these really meaningful connections. So that's where we enter the loneliness loop, and our brain will sort of switch from this organic, like natural social bonding mode to more like a self-preservation mode, because we've been disappointed by other people in the past and we don't want to feel this pain again. It's just like you put your hand on the hot stove once, and you don't want to feel this pain again. So instead, the brain switches to self-preservation, which manifests itself as withdrawal and mistrust in other people, and we read social, like otherwise neutral social signs as hostile social signs. So there was this one time in Portugal where my Portuguese teacher sent me this long message, and she said basically that she can't give me Portuguese lessons anymore, and that she was too busy with her job, and she wished me all the best. But my lonely mind at the time interpreted this as my Portuguese teacher hates me, I was never good at Portuguese anyway, and I should just give up Portuguese lessons. And when I recently reread this text message, I was overwhelmed by the kindness, but I only recognized this kindness from a less lonely place. So these negative biases will slowly project onto other people, and since we start trusting others less or withdraw ourselves from social situations, other people will pick up on this, and then they actually mistrust us because they can see, oh, this person's not really trusting us. But then we only mistrust them, and then they mistrust us, and it's so this vicious cycle. And that's really the loneliness loop, where this mistrust feels to, and this withdrawal feels to, again, to actual social isolation. So if this all sounds a bit gloomy and hopeless and difficult, then that's because it is, because loneliness is really a challenging emotion, and as we've seen, it's really at the root of our survival. So what can we do about it? And I thought about this for a long time, what I'm gonna say here, because in my articles I share some more practical advice, but I think today the one thing I want to share is to cultivate an awareness around loneliness and to see loneliness for what it is. Because loneliness is so stigmatized in modern society, and this only worsens the baseline, let's say, of loneliness that's already there. Like, add the stigma on top, and that really makes you feel bad about feeling lonely. So when we can start to see loneliness for what it actually is, which is just a survival mechanism, and it's our mind telling us to reconnect, I think that already strips away a lot from the scary facade that's built around loneliness. And with that comes a better understanding of, okay, I might have these negative biases, and I'm probably more prone to withdraw when I feel lonely. But then it's about seeing that and still seeking out, still not giving into that. And yeah, I realize this all sounds a bit difficult and not easy to grasp, but yeah, ultimately I think it just comes down to seeing the bias and then still overcoming it by seeing it for what it is, which is a bias and not reality. So if you just take one thing away from this, then let it be that loneliness is not your enemy. It's a natural response from your body, from your mind, that you have unmet needs. And loneliness doesn't make you a worse person or anything else. It's the opposite. Like, loneliness is one of the most human things we can experience as humans, which is a sign to be more social and to reconnect. And that wraps it up for my initial talk about loneliness. I'm hoping you learned something, and now I would love to discuss a few questions if you have any. I see I can announce a Q&A here. I don't know if that will make a difference. Otherwise, until I see any questions. Oh, now I see some. I think they didn't load a few moments ago. Let me just scroll through them. I see a question from Patricia here, which is, how much of a factor was inability to speak the language? I suppose you refer to the time I was in Portugal, and that's a good question, because at first I convinced myself it wasn't, but at the time, at the end of my stay in Portugal, which was about 7 to 8 months, I really noticed how that further increased my perceived isolation, because I was walking on the street and I was hearing people talking and I couldn't understand them, and that always put this barrier between me and them, which again increased this invisible wall of connection. I hope that answers the question. Okay, I see a question here by Luyanda. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I seem to not know what I want most of. I seem to not know what I want most of the times. When I'm among other people, I get very frustrated and want to be alone. However, when I'm alone, I tend to long for some company. What seems to be the problem, and how can I tackle it? It's a great question. I think I often ask myself something very similar, and I think I can relate to this, which is, I think you're talking about this when you're alone in your at home, you feel this need to connect with others, but then you get among friends, and then again you feel like you're out of place there and you would rather be home or among other people. So if that's your question, I understand it correctly. I would say maybe the loneliness formula can help you. So maybe you can ask yourself, why do you have what is the desire you have when you're alone? Is it that you want to be among, that you want a community, like a bigger group of people, or that you want a close group of friends, or a romantic partner? I think analyzing what it really is that causes the loneliness, because there are different types of loneliness, that can help get a better grasp on what it actually is you need. And then when you're among people, it might help ask yourself why it is that you don't perceive the connection. in my own experience, this has often been that we don't really share the same interests, or that we've just lived apart from each other, because sometimes we enter friendships or relationships, and initially it's carried by a shared hobby or shared value interest, but then we go on living life out of comfort like this, and then eventually, at least that's how it was for me, I find myself in this relationship a few years later, and then I realize, oh, this is not actually the person that I originally befriended. And then often it can just help to take a break from that type of person or group, and really examine what it is that it is that caused this loneliness. I hope that somehow answers your question. Okay, I see another comment from Elizabeth. And I think it's not a question, it's just a comment. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions you might have? Dennis asks, and this is where it gets self-indulgent, if I have Twitter or something we can connect. No, I don't have Twitter, but I have a website and I write on Medium. So probably the easiest way is just to find me on Medium. It's just my name, Stephan Joppich, and then I have all the options there to contact and reach out to me. Other than that, if there are no further questions and you have some time left, I can perhaps delve into a question that I often ask myself when I started researching loneliness, which is, can loneliness kill you? Because that's a very sensationalist headline that I've often started seeing. And there's this, it's probably the most famous study on loneliness, which basically showed that loneliness is as deadly as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And let me just check if anyway, to wrap this up, my research, and then when I started researching on this, I think a more nuanced way to say this would be that chronic loneliness can kill. And what actually is so dangerous about loneliness is not the loneliness itself, but the prolonged stress it causes. So I've already mentioned the loneliness loop, and how we get constantly in these situations where we scan other people for hostility. And this is enormous stress for our body. We are constantly in a fight or flight state. And this sort of wear and tear is what actually makes loneliness so dangerous. And as a result, we sleep worse and sleep less, because evolutionarily, in this self-preservation mode, we had to stay up at night, and we were just for ourselves. But this is just something else I wanted to add, that loneliness can kill, yes, but only when it's chronic. And even then, it's not a one strike punch. It's a process that draws itself over many years. And maybe on the good side, any type of connection, any type of human connection, can break us out of this loneliness cycle and is like a soothing balm for our health. So multiple studies have shown that human connections, healthy relationships, are the number one indicator for a happy and healthy life. So I just noticed that my Q&A wasn't really loading, and I see there are a lot of a lot more questions that came in. And we have about 4 minutes left. So I'm just going to try if I find one more question that I can answer. By the way, you probably won't see all the questions because I have to approve them first for some reason. So that's why it might be a bit confusing. I think this is a great question. It's by Menia. If writing and problem solving helped me with this challenge of loneliness, I think yes. I think the more I wrote about loneliness and the more I started understanding it, the more I actually grasped what it actually is. And it helped me realize that loneliness is often kind of the same thing that happens in horror movies. Like, what makes horror movies so scary is that we don't really know what's behind the mask or what this strange demon is that is having all these evil forces. And the same, it's with loneliness. Like, all the stigma makes loneliness so terrifying, and society that tells us that we need to be constantly among great friends and have great relationships and that everything is just fun. And I guess the writing helped me to really understand that loneliness is not a horror movie. It's a natural response. And so yes, I think that helped me a lot. And also something else I can just as one last nugget I can recommend is actually just journaling about the feeling of loneliness, just writing it all down, what you feel, and then re-examining that journal entry for truth, like really scrutinizing it. If this is the reality, like oftentimes we feel like we can feel like we're like unlovable or that we don't have any friends, but most often this is just, or always, this is not reality. This is just inside of our heads. So really writing this out and scrutinizing it helps us get a better grasp on it. I hope that answers your question. And I see we're approaching 10 a.m. Eastern time. So I hope you took away, you learned something from this. And thank you very much for attending. I have another session at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time about minimalism. So if you want to join me, feel free. And also, if you want to read more about loneliness, I will link my collection of articles here. I hope. Yep. I hope you can see that. If not, just go on Medium and search for my name, and then you'll find the articles. So thank you very much for attending, and